First of all, I apologise for being late, typical Republican timing. Last time actually I was in here, I was doing a tutorial at short notice about the 30 Years' War, and a kind of sketchy knowledge of what the 30 Years' War was about. So I was standing in the room like this, talking about the 30 Years' War, and all the students were diligently taking notes, except one woman who stopped and was looking at me. So I said, Roisin, have you any questions? And she said, do you know anything about this? Or she didn't. So I hope I'll know a bit more about this. So briefly, just what I was going to talk about was where nationalists, broadly speaking, are at the moment. As any of us who are active in any way in the media or in politics, in student politics or whatever, in various campaigns, pro-life, whatever, we know that it's a time of pretty much isolation. It's very hard to get a message across, but we're also conscious of the fact that we're part of a much longer heritage, that we didn't just appear like mushrooms overnight like some of the people on the left with no kind of organic links to the Irish people, the Irish nation, including people who currently run the Republican movement. I'll also be talking about the relationship between contemporary nationalism, as in proper nationalism, and the Republican movement, past and present, and where we might be going in the future. Again, as any of you will know, including people who are involved with Griffith and people who are involved with the Burkean, it's very, very hard to try and negotiate, navigate your way around the censorship that's in place at the moment. We're constantly under attack, people reporting our stories from minor factual details, threatening to take us down. We're under some sort of ban from YouTube at the moment, where videos that might run up 15, 20,000 views within a week or two, that people will report them and they'd be restricted over the most trivial issues. So you're always kind of on tenterhooks. It doesn't really bother me when I'm writing something, because you're just writing off the top of your head, but then it's kind of become the people who are running sites. It probably doesn't apply to the Burkean as much, but certainly in Grip, that there's kind of an internal sense you're wondering, will we get away with this? We've been sued by threatened, we've been sued by the INTO, all sorts of different characters. So there's that issue. And then of course you have all these creatures like Mark Malone and people who work for Sinn Féin, whose full-time occupation at the expense of the taxpayer through the NGOs which employ them, seem to be trying to dox and track and out and get people who are on the right, the far right, sacked or censored. So you're up against that as well. There's even take to a ludicrous extreme. I'm a lot of interest in GAA, and I read quite a lot of GAA sites, even on boards.ie and the GAA forums. There's moderators on boards.ie who censor trivial stuff on GAA chats. If I remember one person, he was involved with a major club, who I won't name, and he said something kind of like in a passing joke, saying, of course a man can't just become a woman, and he got banned from boards.ie. It's just lunacy. And the same applies to Hogan Stand. There was an argument, there was a thread on Hogan Stand a couple of weeks ago about vaccination and about the number of COVID deaths, and somebody compared it to mortality figures, and same thing, he was just warned and then banned and his posts disappeared. Anyway, it'll please any of you to know who are in that situation that we're not unique in that, because we're part of a longer heritage, and thanks to Caddle in particular, and a number of other sites, including one attached to the University of Cork, there's a vast reservoir now available online of writings by people like Mitchell, Davis and others, which you can access. And I'd see all of us as part of that tradition. In particular, I'd like to talk just for a minute about the influence of Thomas Davis and the Nation, which was established just before the Great Hunger. And I think Michael Collins probably summed Davis up fairly well when he said that Davis spoke to the soul of a nation which was drunk within the waters of forgetfulness, which probably sums up quite accurately where the people of this country were, particularly in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, after the devastation of the Great Hunger, the forced migrations, the land repossessions, and so on. And the nation was written in English. There was no Irish language press, but it was written at a time when people, due to various psychological issues that they associate the Irish language with, kind of despair, defeat, people were moving into cities like Dublin, Limerick, Galway, into the larger towns, so English was becoming their main language. And the nation came along at a time when still literacy was still quite rare, but there was a habit around the country where people would get copies of the nation, and people who could read English would read it and sometimes translate it into Irish for people in their own homes sitting around the fire at night time. And in that way, Davis and the nation and the people who came after him were able to keep alive the whole idea of Irish nationhood. And it's a lot of what we know, the ballads and mythology and folklore associated with 1898 and 1848, that would have come from the nation, because that would have permeated into the national consciousness when there was nothing else. There was no how would you say, there was no reflections of that heritage within the broader Anglophone culture other than within the nation. And say this was particularly important as it preserved that kind of spark of nationhood when people started to emigrate into the diaspora in Britain and America, and when people started to become urbanised in the large cities and towns. And one of the people who would have seen himself directly as a successor of Thomas Davis was Arthur Griffith. Griffith wasn't the only major nationalist journalist and publisher of the late 19th century. There were others like D.P. Moran, James Connolly, Pearse, obviously, and people who were associated with Clive Sullish, Alice Milligan and Shan Van Vogt. And there was kind of a mosquito press of different people come from different. Like D.P. Moran and Connolly wouldn't have had much in common politically or economically, but they were part of that broad national consensus. But Griffith, to me, seemed to kind of embody, he tried to encapsulate what there was of that. And so this was at a time when Griffith was most active in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. This was at a time when Anglicisation was particularly prevalent. You had English popular culture was becoming more available. You had people were beginning to become interested in soccer. You had music halls, kind of the early tabloid press was becoming more widely read. And there was a line in one of the Irish school books in the National School where they're becoming a happy English child. So people were losing all that kind of sense of nationhood. And there was also, in combination with that, the fact that the political elite through the Irish Party after Parnell had come to accept that they'd come to abandon the notion of independence and sovereignty because they were being promised land reform and were being promised limited autonomy as part of the United Kingdom under Home Rule. So there was a danger, and Griffith sensed this, that the whole notion of Irish independence and nationhood would be swept aside and would be lost as this process of Anglicisation and incorporation into the British state, democratic state, proceeded. Now, I just have a slight digression here, because when I was young, 9 or 10, I first heard of Griffith and other people who were major figures in the national movement from my grandmother, who, when we were kids, she had lots of books about the Tam War and earlier periods. So she'd be going through, and if there was photographs, she knew a lot of these people, and her father and brother knew a lot of the people, and she'd be talking about them. And of course, kids, we just really wanted to know about Collins and the people who were out shooting Brits and Black and Tans and stuff like that, because that was the exciting part. And to me, I could never understand why Griffith and Collins were her two heroes. I could never really understand why she saw Griffith as such an icon, because to me, first of all, they're within a kind of anti-republican tradition, which most of my family were. Griffith was a free stater, obviously, and not only that, but he had opposed the Rising in 1916 and hadn't taken part in it. But of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. Griffith's reasons for not taking part in the Rising were, I think, based on his knowledge of what Fenianism, particularly in Dublin, had become in the 1890s, where it kind of degenerated into little cliques of basically gangs. They were deeply infiltrated by Dublin Castle and British intelligence. People like Tom Clark and others had come from America. They walked into traps set by British intelligence for bombing campaigns that were probably not going to achieve very much anyway, which, if you leap forward more than a century afterwards, something similar is happening with all these small micro Republican groups in my estimation. So I think that's where Griffith was come from, and Griffith believed that rather than spend your whole life, rather than divert all these basically good people with good ideas, good national principles, into cul-de-sacs of planning for an insurrection that's probably never going to happen, and spend their whole life in internal feuds, maybe killing the odd informer or the odd detective in Dublin Castle, Griffith thought, no, what we need to do is we need to win the battle of ideas. We need to win the people of Ireland over to the idea of nationhood, and the way to do that is not sit in the pub in Gardner Street plotting with your friends about killing somebody in the castle. It's to go into the GAA, go into the Gaelic League, go into the unions, go into the cooperatives, go into the people, and that's where the revolution, the roots of the revolution came from, not from the small groups which survived from the Fenians. And Clark and other people reformed the IRB on those lines to try and make it a mass movement, albeit in a kind of a secretive way where they infiltrated. But Griffith, I think, was a very important figure in that, and all the people, Boland, Collins and others, they all recognised the key influence of Griffith. And the reason I dwell so much on them now is, come from a perspective where I wouldn't have had that much time for him, I wouldn't have had that much regard for him, that now in the situation where Irish nationalism, the idea of Irish sovereignty, the idea of our heritage and its uniqueness and the need to safeguard it from being destroyed, which it's under danger of, that we need sometimes to go back to those older ideas and think, what examples can we take from the people who came before us, including Davis and Griffith. And just on my grandmother, she was from generational Dubs. They could trace their family back, on my father's grandmother's side, back to the late 1700s. So they would have had long lost contact with Irish as a speaking language. And there was people like Griffith, and there was the Gaelic League, the GAA, that revived all that. And I don't think people realise how important that was, because she would have grown up in Dublin. She was born in 1902, so she was a teenager during all the revolutionary years. Her father was a Fenian before that, and her grandfather had been involved in the Invincibles. But they would have had no contact with the older culture, with the language, and it was the Gaelic League which revived that. And my grandmother used to go to evening classes, and that's how she learned Irish. Now, she never became fluent, but she had enough to be able to help my father and my uncles and their sister when they were going to school. And she was absolutely, fixated on the idea of Irish Ireland, as D.P. Moran described it, to the extent that when she'd visit our house, and I used to follow Leeds United when I was a kid because Johnny Giles used to play for them. And she came to our house and we were watching Match of the Day. She'd just get up and switch turn the channel. We only had 3 channels, so she'd put it back onto BBC or RTE. So I don't know whether that was. And the other thing, contradiction, I suppose, from her, despite the fact that she reared a family, including my father and uncles, who some of them were members of the IRA and took the, two of them were on the Provo side in the split, that my grandmother actually remained an out-and-out free stater. In fact, I go as describe her as a blue shirt right until her dying day. And she used to vote for all sorts of creatures like Maurice Dockrell, who was a TD in Dublin South Centre for years, who she would have had absolutely nothing in common with, other than that he stood for the Treaty Party and she hated De Valera, and that was enough for her. Anyway, to get back to Griffith. Griffith, he was a really prolific journalist. He edited 6 or 7 major newspapers, including Era, Nationality, an anti-censorship paper called Scissors and Paste, which he published during World War I, Sinn Féin. And it's kind of remarkable because there was a lot of people who were involved in the national movement at the time who kind of, they were quite a bit sectarian. They would have, people in the IRB wouldn't have trusted people who weren't in the IRB, and people who were in the language movement mightn't necessarily trusted people who couldn't speak Irish or didn't want to speak Irish. And Griffith's attitude was, when he was running Sinn Féin or Nationality or Era, said, if you agree on basic principles, then our pages are open to you. And he allowed Connolly, he cooperated with Connolly on various things, including opposition to the royal visits in the early 1900s, opposition to recruitment of Irish people for the Boer War, and he also endorsed Connolly as a local election candidate in 1903, which was before Griffith had founded Sinn Féin. So this myth that, that Griffith and Connolly were kind of two opposite wings of the national movement, left and right, and that Griffith hated trade unions, that's nonsense. He didn't like Larkin for some reason. A lot of people didn't like Larkin. But Griffith was a member of the printing trade union all his life. So he wasn't anti-trade union, and he certainly wasn't opposed to what Connolly was doing. And the two of them, it's just used as an example how disparate elements of the national movement could come together, and how it did come together in a much more significant way in 1916 and afterwards. And also, Griffith, when people used to say, why'd you print that letter, or why'd you let him write an article in Sinn Féin? And Griffith's response was, why should we grow censors in our own country? And his attitude was, look, Dublin Castle are watching us all the time. They're trying to censor us, they're trying to close down their newspapers, they're trying to, if they can, they put editors in prison if they can get away with it. So it's not our job to censor other Irish people, whether they're socialists or whatever. We'll print anybody as long as they're coming from the same direction. And I think that's a lesson too that all of us might take, that we don't. I think there is a fair degree of cooperation and there's probably healthy competition as well, but you don't want to get into a situation where you have like 40 people in the room and they're all members of 15 different groups, and we don't like the person who's the national chairman or something, so we don't talk to each other or we don't cooperate. Because if we do that, we just end up being destroyed, as far as I'm concerned. So, yes, his involvement with the Rising, he said he didn't take part in the Rising, but he made himself, once he knew the Rising had started, he made it known to the IRB that he was prepared to do whatever they wished. McDermott's idea was actually that they didn't want Griffith too involved in the actual preparation for the Rising, because they wanted Griffith to be one of those people who would have remained after the insurrection as a political figure, which he did become, obviously. So, another thing I think we could take from him and from that period is that after 1916, Griffith was very unpopular among the IRB, and he had to be, people like Collins and Boland and De Valera had to persuade the volunteers, had to persuade people in the IRB to allow Griffith to remain basically as the figurehead, as president of Sinn Féin, and as major figure within Dáil next to De Valera. And I think that again has lessons for nationalists now, that Sinn Féin after 1916, after 1917, or there's a whole lot of preparation that went into it, that there's not that much documentation on it because of the period in which they were operating, that they didn't want to leave too much evidence around for the enemy to find out. But certainly what you take from it is that the people who came together in Sinn Féin in 1917 and then won the election in 1918 had agreed that, okay, Griffith wants to have a queen, a nominal monarch, as he explained in his book, the insurrection in Hungary. We have people who call themselves Marxists, and we have people in the IRB who think that we should organise another insurrection as soon as we can. We have people who've got fed up with the Irish Party, we have people from trade unions, we have people who've been elected as Labour candidates in local elections. So we need to bring all these people together once they agree on one basic principle, which was recognition of Dáil Éireann and refusal to stay as part of the British political administration in Ireland. So if you were to take that, to bring that forward to now, what I think, if anybody who's serious about challenging the orthodoxy that we see permeates the whole entire political establishment, almost every party, you could say bar Aintu probably in Leinster House, they all agree on absolutely everything. They could all, if most TDs in Leinster House were transplanted to the United States, to be all in the Democratic Party. They're just different varieties of the same ideology. And if we're to counter that, we need to create a similar broad movement where we disagree on whatever. I'm not talking about people dissolving their own organisations or dissolving their own parties or standing down their own websites or whatever. That you maintain your own integrity, but you come together on certain basic principles, which would obviously be Irish sovereignty. For me, pro-life would be certainly essential to that, and total opposition to this woke ideology that's trying to force upon people. Because nobody else is doing it. And there's no point in all these little groups. And it does work to some extent effectively because you're getting different points of view and, say competition is good. And, it's kind of like a bit like Griffith's time. You have all this kind of mosquito effect where people are coming at from different angles. But if we're talking seriously about a political opposition to what's going on, we need to start thinking about how do you take them on in elections, how do you take them on to build a broad movement, how to counter all of this through the media, but also you need boots on the ground, you need people being elected, and you need people who you can see the Peter Casey election, he ran for president, and when he ran for the European elections, even though Casey's a bit of a chancellor, in my opinion, I hope I'm not offending anybody here, but when he was interviewed by the hot press afterwards, and the hot press put him on the spot and said, oh, you're like a dog whistle to the far right, and all these people came out and voted for you because they think you represent what they believe in, which he did. I voted for him. Then I read his interview and he said, oh, well, I support abortion, I support mass immigration, and support, yeah. Now, so the hot press were happy, and then people who thought that they were voting for something different realised what he was. But it does prove that despite all the propaganda and despite the fact that Casey came out of nowhere, that there's a groundswell there that can be tapped into. Even just the results of the two last referendums, it's 30%, there's a third of the population. That's hundreds of thousands of people think the way we do on the main issues: pro-life, immigration, national sovereignty, including attitudes to the EU, and opposition to the nonsense that they're seeing being forced upon their kids in school through all this woke ideology. It's how to tap into that. And there's no point in nationalists running 4 candidates under 4 different names for one local election seat or in one Leinster House constituency. And I'm not talking about people dissolving their own parties or all coming together in a formal, create a new party out of that. Similar to Sinn Féin in 1917, people can come together on certain core issues, agree on that and say, similar to what has happened people look at, say, Orbán in Hungary or the peace and justice in Poland, or even Vox in Spain. Some of the Italians obviously still have lots of different groups, but there's no major party. What happened in Hungary wasn't just one party dominating the whole thing. It was bringing different people who agreed on fundamentals together, and the same happened in Poland. It shows it can be done, even just for electoral purposes. And when you win, when you defeat your main enemy, then you can, as happened here, with possibly not very healthy consequences. We had the Civil War, but once you achieve your main objective, then you can disagree and sort out all the other differences. But unless we do that, unless we come to some sort of accommodation and create that sort of movement, it's going to be lost. We're going to be sitting here in 10 years, be lost. The country be gone. So, and the other thing, just briefly, is something that myself in Griffith have been trying to do, and the Burkean published a very interesting piece by Thomas Davis called Feudalism on Feudalism, that nationalists are kind of deficient, I think, on the economic argument, and which was something that Griffith also stressed that in the 1890s and the early 1900s, and the Republican movement abandoned it all in the 1970s and 80s in favour of Marxism on the official side and kind of national liberationism on the Provo side. Provo's now just adopted kind of middle road social democracy. But if you go back, there's a very coherent nationalist economic argument for protectionism, for using our natural resources, fish, not exporting live cattle, not allowing foreign fleets to take all our fish and process them abroad, not allowing IT, pharmaceuticals to dominate the economy to such an extent. There needs to be a nationalist argument to counter that, because we've done a few pieces on Google and high tech, the fact that 70% of Google Ireland's workforce are non-Irish. It's what Google do. They bring in people, a lot of them even from outside the EU and the EEA area. They stay here for a year or two, they train them, then they move them on. Despite the fact that there's 5,000 or 6,000 IT graduates in this country, I think, every year. A lot of them emigrate, or a lot of them go into different parts of the economy. With this notion that you hear, we need them we need the immigrants because Irish people are too stupid or they don't want to do these jobs. That's nonsense. And apart from that, why should any sovereign state be so beholden to a sector that employs, I think, 40,000 people, as exports valued at 35 billion a year, but employs a relatively small amount of Irish people, doesn't pay very much corporation tax, and has the whole, that we're supposed to look up to them all the time. So basically that's it. So just leave that at that.